Welcome class to your virtual on Microsoft SQL Server. In today's class we're going to split this into several sessions as we start to walk through an overall introduction to SQL Server. As with your previous lectures related to Microsoft Access, Microsoft SQL Server is also a database server. Essentially it is the key primary database product of Microsoft. As you've been using in class, Microsoft Access is more of a personal database, whereas Microsoft SQL Server is more of an enterprise solution used for large businesses and large databases. The key with Microsoft SQL Server is that it enables users to write queries and other SQL statements as well as executing them. In terms of differentiators between SQL Server and Microsoft Access, the four areas where we're going to comment on today are the Query Analyzer, the Profiler, the Service Manager, as well as the Bulk Copy program. When I talk about the Profiler, essentially what I'm looking at is the overall monitoring tool that is leveraged within SQL Server. This is used primarily for performance tuning, but also for event monitoring. This will become key for you as you look at different security and audit protocols, as well as looking at how you are going to be able to track individual transactions and individual queries. When speaking about Service Manager, the key with Service Manager is it is necessary when you're managing more than one instance of SQL Server on a machine. In that situation, your first instance will always be called a default instance, and the rest of those instances are called named instances. As previously discussed in class with some of the larger databases that we deal, you'll typically see anywhere between 2 and 18 databases on an individual server. Running Service Manager helps the SQL Server DBAs in terms of both starting and stopping the databases individually, which allows for the sites to stay up properly that are running on those databases. Instance is a key expression that I believe we need to spend some time talking about. When we look at database instances, each instance is hidden from another instance. This becomes key when we start talking about software as a service, as most customers want to ensure that their database and their data is separate from those of their competitors. By going with an instances route, instances help enhance security overall, due primarily to the fact that you would have your own set of users, admins, databases, and collations. Personally, I find that some of the key advantages of having multiple instances is for, again, multi-company support in such situations as software as a service, as well as server consolidation. When I look at some of our larger host customers, the key with having multiple instances is it allows each of our customers to have their own instance even though they're on a shared database server, and have those instances separate and independent of each other. It's also allowed us to reduce the footprint in our data center from a server consolidation approach by allowing us to put more instances on individual servers. Another key differentiator with SQL Server is the bulk copy program. Essentially, that is a command line utility, and we'll be showing command line utilities in the virtual lectures today, that enables you to transfer a large number of records from a file to a database. You'll see this more done at the command prompt, which is going to give you a much different look and feel than what you're used to dealing with related to Access. It allows you essentially to get some time back as it moves more quickly in terms of the copying of files, and it is essential in backup and restoration, especially for your larger databases. As we get deeper into queries, the key that we'll be looking at from that perspective is the overall Query Analyzer. From a Query Analyzer perspective, essentially what I look at is how it allows us to both write queries and SQL statements and check that we've written them correctly. By checking the syntax, it's really allowing us to make sure that we'll be able to properly execute the statements as well as save the results. And to some level, view reports. Typically, we'll see reports both in either grid or text format. In addition, we will see reports in a report manager or reporting tool. When we initially walked through Microsoft Access, we spent a fair amount of time talking about database objects and understanding database objects. As we look at SQL Server, you're going to see some of the same terms and some of the same expressions, and the same rules will apply. Typically, when we're talking about objects within SQL Server, we're talking of tables, views, stored procedures, functions, rules, defaults, cursors, and triggers. By default, SQL Server has 4 databases. We'll be spending most of our time focusing on the master, which contains stored procedures and login details. Additionally, we'll be looking at the model, which is the template for creating a database, the tempDB, which stores your temporary files, and the MSDB, which is going to contain all of your details related to alerts and jobs. The MSDB deals specifically with the SQL Server agent service when running agents on your database. Essentially, you'll need a master database when creating a database. That's going to consist of 2 database files. Similar to the database files on Access in terms of a .mdb, the master data file within SQL Server is a .mdf file location. Additionally, a primary log file is created at a .ldf. As we look through separate database operations, you'll see the ability to use and create and change a database, create a database, and drop a database. In this situation, you'll be using a master and identifying file size, max size, and file growth. From a data type perspective, you'll see these very similar to both Oracle and Microsoft Access, with integers storing a whole number, float real numbers, text storing characters, decimal storing real numbers, money storing monetary data, date storing time, binary storing images, and other miscellaneous field types. From an operator perspective, we'll be focusing on arithmetic, including plus, minus, multiplication, division, and percentage, assignment, comparison in terms of such things as greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, less than or equal to, etc. Logical operators like and, or, not, in, like, between, any, all, and exists. From a string perspective, focusing on concatenation. From urinary perspective, focusing on plus and minus, as well as from a bitwise perspective. As we look at select statements, we'll be looking at executing select statements in MS SQL by selecting the statement and clicking on the Execute button in the Query Analyzer. This allows you to retrieve records from a table, and below you'll see examples of running select statements within SQL Server. As we look at select options, this allows us to view distinct rows and distinct keywords. From a distinct name from keywords perspective, you'll look at aggregate functions such as sum, max, min, average, and count. Next, talking about table management, this will allow us to essentially look at creating tables as well as dropping tables. I tend to like to avoid the drop table statement as is difficult to recover from. The following are examples of how to write statements related to inserting statements into all columns as well as inserting data to selected columns. As with the other databases that we reviewed, the update statement is critical in terms of updating a database. The statements below will allow you to update students to set ID equal to 3. This will set ID equals 3 for all students, as well as allow you to change and modify conditions. If we're looking at the delete statement of deleting from Table 1 all rows in Table 1 and deleting from Table 1 where condition exists, this will allow you to delete students with student IDs as specified. When looking at the truncate statement, truncate does the following where the database statement does not. Truncate will allow you to release the memory used, reset the identity value. At the same time, truncate does not involve a delete trigger. Alter statements are predominantly used to modify the table structure. As such, it will allow you to add new columns, change the data type of existing columns, delete a column, and add or remove constraints like a foreign key or a primary key. When looking at more table commands, essentially we're looking at how we are viewing tables in the database and what we are doing to give all tables in the database certain values. This will be more evident as we look at viewing and demoing what SQL Server looks like. The last slide of this first part of the virtual lecture is related to joins. The 4 types of joins that we'll need to be concerning about in lecture part 2 is the cross join, which simply merges 2 tables, the inner join, which is used to find matching records in the 2 tables, the outer join, which is used to find an unmatched row in the 2 tables, and the self join, which is joining tables with themselves. This concludes part 1 of the Microsoft SQL Server virtual lecture.